Ezra-Nechemiah. It is the 28th day of the month of February. We are in chapter 3, verse 10. Who would like to read? Let's go around. We waste too much time asking. Mark, do you want to start?
Sure. When the builders had laid the foundation of the sanctuary of Hashem, they stationed the Kohanim, elegantly attired, with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise Hashem through the Psalms of David, king of Israel.
Okay. So, I'll open up. Any thoughts, any reactions? A couple things strike me. One, we have a series of psalms that are psalms of Bnei Asaph, and you can check the lineage of Asaph. It's in Chronicles. Again, when things are in Chronicles that aren't in other places, it's interesting. But First Chronicles chapter 6, and the tracing of Asaph as a Levi, or as a Bain Levi, as a Levite. Mm-hmm. So that's one. And second, in the same way that I said a minute ago about Ezra, that here in the book of Ezra, that first Rosh Hashanah is about sacrifice, not about reading the Torah, which is what it is in Nehemiah 8. Here, we have David remembered, and one of the issues that we're actually going to face for the rest of Jewish history, not just in the book of Ezra, is what's the return all about? And the easiest answers for their return is that it's either about temple or it's about kingship. Right? Because we know First Temple times, we call it First Temple times, but it's really about kingship. We don't have a whole lot of biblical accounting of the First Temple. It's there, it's important, I don't want to poo-poo it. But First Temple times are dominated by kingship. And now that they're coming back, are they coming back to reinstitute monarchy? Or are they coming back to reinstitute the holy altar and the holy temple? Or are they coming back for both? And if you remember, we commented on it, I don't know, last week, a couple weeks ago, that they're very careful that all of this so far has been Yeshua ben Yotzadak, who's the priest, and his brothers, the Kohanim, and Zerubbabel, who is a descendant of David. So we've had king and priest throughout, but now, to finish the thought here it mentions King David, but as they are gathering to rebuild, not a palace, but the temple, and how is David remembered?
As the singer.
Correct. He's given his title. You couldn't just say David. You got to say Melech, King David. But it's David who gave the priest the songbook for the temple. It's David the liturgist, right? So far we keep seeing this focus, even though the descendants of David are present, and Zerubbabel plays a key role with Yeshua the priest throughout. The focus is about temple. It's not about the reinstitution of monarchy.
The current Rosh Hashanah liturgy is very much about kingship, declaring God as
outstanding.
King. So somehow fits the 7th month scenario.
That's really, really nice, right? We do during Rosh Hashanah, we do the 3 services, and one of them is Malchut Yod, which is about God's dominion. Very nice. And we're going to get to the blowing of the shofar as well. Yeah.
I'm wondering, there's a third leg missing for me, and that is peoplehood. And that it seems to be that in fact, I guess I'm putting it out as speculation. Is it possible that the writing of the Torah, the assembly of the Torah in Babylon, was as much about trying to preserve peoplehood? I mean, there seems to be, with trying to keep the Israelites pure, or the Jews pure in Israel when they return, there is, I think, under here a subtext of trying to build a wall around the people of Israel.
Good. So we haven't seen much yet, but that's going to change now. The stuff that we've seen has a good sense of unity. It's the Ki'ish Echad, right? That Harvey mentioned, that we talked about a minute ago. That everybody's gathered together. And now we're going to start to worry about who are the everybody. Now they've already been worried about it because we got a list of 32,000 people, almost by name, right? But we're going to keep worrying now about who are these everybody, and that will remain one of the themes. Because at the one hand, it's the group and the group identity. And on the other hand, part of it is about who's not in the group. And the book is going to worry a lot about that, especially later. But some of it will come up today, I think. All right, next verse. Marilyn?
They sang songs extolling and praising the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love for Israel is eternal. All the people raised a great shout extolling the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord had been laid.
Great. So we have this wonderful line. You know, I would say Tov lehodot ladonai, right? We have and it even uses the word Hallel, which is fun, as opposed to Hallelujah or another frame, because we call instead of Psalms Hallel. And uvehodot ladonai ki tov ki le'olam chasdo. Makes you want to, wait 2 more weeks from that Rosh Hashanah and shake the lulav. We just had, Purim, we sang Hallel, ki le'olam chasdo. Tov lehodot ladonai, or any whole bunch. Look in Psalm 106, Psalm 136. Those are the classic places for the refrain. But we have it all over. Here, the author knows what they sang in the temple. This is it. Good. And you again have V'chol ha'am. And so every place we see it in Torah, and here as well, the stressing of unity, the stressing of everybody coming together. And Heriu Trua Gedolah is really fun on Rosh Hashanah. Right? They blasted a loud call, or they made a great shout, or however one wants to translate it. But Yom Trua Lachem, right? It's for you a day of making big noises. And here they're sounding it, and they're doing it again in Hallel and so forth. And it's because, no mention of Rosh Hashanah. It's because of Husad Beit Adonai. It's because they've laid the foundation. And that's another great word, by the way, a great biblical word. The foundational word is a great biblical word about how God creates and what we do, and it's fun to play with. Good? Al? Oh.
In the bracket, I always get a little, in the Stone edition, it's got elegantly, they put in brackets the word elegantly.
Where?
Just before attired. Kohanim elegantly attired. I wondered why they, I wouldn't expect people to, but it's funny that they would pick that.
In case you missed it, they're melubashim, the things that they are dressed in, or aren't their weekday clothes.
I think I know why, because the Hebrew makes it sound a little funny. Melubashim b'chatzotzot.
It's like they're wearing trumpets.
Because there's no other word. There's only one word for dress. So Stone wants to tell you the idea is that they were dressed in their best vestments and not in the chatzotzot, because the next word after melubashim is b'chatzotzot, in the trumpets. So it's kind of missing.
Yeah.
Hakohanim melubashim nicely.
Nice. All right, Al, 12.
Many of the priests and Levites and the chiefs of the clans, the old men who had seen the first house, wept loudly at the sight of the founding of this house. Many others shouted joyously at the top of their voices.
Okay, let's get verse 13 also, just because I want to read them together.
The people could not distinguish the shouts of joy from the people's weeping, for the people raised a great shout, the sound of which could be heard from afar.
All right, so there are 2 different noises being made. We as the reader can distinguish them. What are the 2 different noises?
Weeping and shouts.
Good, so what are shouting for joy? It's very clear. It says, Truat HaSimcha, the calling of happiness. What's the call of joy about? What's that shout about?
The laying foundation.
The laying the foundation. And what's the crying about?
Remembering the destruction of the first one?
Maybe. One possibility is that they suffered a long time to get here, and there are people who, even though it's a joy thing, maybe.
And it's probably much smaller than what they remember.
Yeah.
It was Solomon's temple that they remembered.
The parallel passages from the beginning of the 2nd chapter of Haggai, and the people are disappointed.
Of course.
Right? And we know that at least up until relatively late in Second Temple period under King Herod, that it was a shrine. It wasn't holy. It wasn't the grandeur of the first temple. So a couple of amazing things. One, Can you imagine? Now, how old do you have to be amongst those who cry?
80.
It says.
70s, 80 years old.
It was 50 years, so if you were youngish,
Correct.
kind of late teens or even 20s,
Oh, right.
you're now in your 70s.
Correct. So 70 is kind of a good frame of reference for an age, give or take a few. Dating is very hard in some of this stuff and whatever else. But we're in the beginning of the rebuilding that's about to be paused. So only the old people, I don't want to say that about anybody 70, but back then 70 was old. Only the old people are crying. So who do you think makes more noise and who do you think is more numerous? So what does it mean? Think about the detail that's given. It doesn't make me cry. It doesn't make me cry because I'm part of the young people. I'm not 70 yet. It doesn't make me cry that the old people were crying because the best they could do so far doesn't measure up to the grandeur that was. That's real. I get why they would cry. I don't minimize their cry. But that's not a tragic detail in the book for me because, this is the beginning of the rebuilding. This is a whole lot better than it was a year before. I get why the other people are excited, but if you only knew how good it was in my youth, I get those people crying, and I don't find their crying tragic. But then it says, Ve'ein ha'am makirin kol truat hasimcha lekol bechi ha'am. Ki ha'am meri'im trua gdola. Right? The people couldn't, they can't distinguish. If you were just to hear the audio tape, or if you were there, what do you think you're hearing?
The Torah.
You're only hearing the joy.
The joy.
That strikes me as tragic.
That there was no acknowledgement.
None. First of all, respect to our elders in general. Respect as we do this. The reason why this matters so much, God didn't tell us to do it. God told Solomon what and how. Right? We're repeating. So those who knew what it was should be exalted at this moment. They survived. They survived the destruction. They survived exile. They survived the return. They should be exalted. Right? And at the very least, they should be heard. And they're not even heard. I find that when part of the theme of this book, at least the way that we're going to read it, I don't know that it's always been this way, but it's in the book. It's not a mistaken reading.
It's the way history is today.
Is the way, correct. I agree very much so. But one of the sensitivities that we're going to have, and Bill keeps pointing it out, is not only the narrative voice of who are the heroic people in it, but who are those who are ostracized, who are those who are excluded, who are those who are disenfranchised through the return and the rebuilding. And we have here a form of disenfranchising of those who should be at the front of the parade. And one little verse, one little comment. And you get it, by the way. I mean, old people, in a quiet room, old people complain louder than others. But at Mardi Gras, the old people tend to not make as much noise as the young people.
I could also see that these people crying at the foundation, but they could be crying from joy too.
They could be, but I don't think the text says that. And I'll tell you why. I don't know that I'm right. And in fact, one of these translations, maybe the New Revised, makes their crying joyful. Mm-hmm. But if their crying is joyful, then it's not being drowned out by the shout of joyful. It's part of the expression of joy. I think the idea that it's being drowned out, for me, means that it's different. And not just, right? When you go to a wedding and people are laughing and people are crying and it's all joyful, those people aren't lost. They're part of the joy. But when you go to a wedding and somebody's sad, whatever this, I don't know the story, right? That's what I think. So I don't know that I'm right, but that's the way that I would read it because it makes more sense that the text goes out of its way to say that you can't distinguish, that they're getting drowned out. This is Josephus' account. Now, Josephus wasn't there, okay? Josephus is not a reliable historian for things when he was there, even more so when he wasn't there. I didn't even save my own. We don't have to read it now.
See, it's interesting. The translation in the new JPS says, many others shouted joyously. Right, to distinguish.
Never mind.
them from the ones who are weeping, whereas the older translation
So
doesn't.
many
It just
or
says,
most.
It just says, not most, it just says many. And okay, so then the old men had seen, right, cried, and many shouted aloud for joy.
Correct. I think the distinction there, with the Rabbim, that word that's done many or many others there, what it does for me is to say that that's the majority. The Rabbim were shouting happily. There were those who, who were in the minority who were weeping. I don't like the many others because that implies more of a sense of equal than I think the Hebrew does. Because there are those elderly who do this, and then the Rabbim, most of them, or the majority, or the masses, B'truah, b'simcha, le'arim, kol. A lot of good, loud words in there. Jacob?
Well, the context of who's writing the story, too.
Correct.
Because these people are the founders of the Second Temple.
Nice.
Look at it from their point of view.
And in credit to those who are writing the story, the old people aren't drowned out. Their crying is not drowned out in the writing.
In the writing.
It's mentioned.
Right? It's in the writing, which gives us the opportunity, I think, to mourn that it was drowned out in the celebration. But, to the credit of the author, it's contained there. Yeah, Jackie?
I would think that part of the crying or the weeping, especially in older people, is because they remember the past and they know that the past is not going to be, it's not going to be the same as it was, but just in remembering the grandeur of the past.
Good. So that's, I think, remembering the grandeur of the past, I think, is how I read it. Remembering the past in general, right? There are people who mourn in their old age because, what's that great song from Pippin? When the future is shorter, the best are brighter still. Something along those lines. Charlemagne's grandma sings it in Pippin. It's something about 64, but whenever I say that, it comes out the Beatles.
Yeah.
So, but it's a great, great song that his grandma sings in Pippin. But so some of that is just having survived the destruction, survived and so forth. But the text is explicit. It's not just that they're old. They are old and they saw the first temple. I think it's begging that's why they're crying. Because they see, this is the best that we can do. All right. Chapter 4. Bill.
When the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord God of Israel,
Do another verse.
they approached Zerubbabel and the chiefs of the clans and said to them, "Let us build with you, since we too worship your God, having offered sacrifices to him since the time of King Ezra-Nechemiah of Syria, who brought us here."
Okay. So, in the simplest, a group.
I'm sorry, I thought we had this.
That's okay. For the record, if you weren't talking, nobody on the video would know it was you. Because that's what my ringtone sounds like, so it would look really bad in the video. A group comes, and they are identified not as friends, right? But as tsuris, right? They come in some kind of negative way, and they came because they heard what was happening. They approached the chiefs, and if we take them at their word, what do they want to do? They want to help. And why do they want to help?
They want to participate.
Because they claim that they worship the same God.
You guys are so cynical because they claim that they worship. Because they do worship. Fine, either way. Right? Because they worship. Notice, I don't think they say Yod Hey Vav. Hey? Who do they worship? Your God. Just be clear. Because the question, who are they, who aren't they? They don't say we worship the same God. They say we worship your God.
Do you have the part in Melachim where it tells about when they were brought to it?
So I have a couple of texts to take a look at if people want to. It's not totally clear who these people are. So there's a real question about it.
Because part of it is hilariously funny with the lions.
With the lions.
Oh, I'll find it.
All right, so find it.
Yeah, I'll find it.
So Esar Hadon is Sargon II, Ashurbanipal, I forget who comes before Sargon II, and then Esarhaddon, 681 to 669. So, a solid generation or two after the conquest of the north. And there's an argument as to whether or not you can find a parallel that Isaiah refers to in Isaiah chapter 7, as to whether or not these are the people that are brought in. Again, if you go back to Sargon II, to the conquest 40 years before, and that may be the King's passage, but I'm not sure, that Sargon II brings in foreigners to marry with the daughters of Israel. Okay? But that's not, so maybe they just misidentify how they got there. They're now solid 150 years later. And they may credit the wrong Assyrian king for having been the one to bring them in. But there is some possibility of movements of peoples generations later, and that's the reference in Isaiah 7. And there's a reference to Esarhaddon in Pritchard. And I still can't find my copy of Pritchard. So Ruth, if you want to start bringing yours every week.
Okay.
Until I either find mine or give up and buy a new one. But there's an inscription there that seems to be about more movement of peoples, not with Sargon II, but with Esarhaddon. And we know of 2 Kings 17. Yeah, sorry. We know of, from Jeremiah, that there still are worship cultic sites in the north, in Shechem and in Shiloh, sites that are very important in the biblical tradition. And so there would still be worshippers. Again, it doesn't say Yod He Vav He, but it says Elohim, your Elohim. And the passage in 2 Kings 17 is, in the latter part of the chapter, talks about syncretic religion, talks about doing your God and my God.
The lions were eating them, and they complained to the Assyrian king, "What did you bring us here for?" So he had to send a Kohen to teach them how to worship God, so the lions would stop eating them.
Really?
That's what it says
Nice.
here.
I don't remember the passage.
Well, after that, there is the syncretic religion when they worship
They weren't going to stop.
and their own gods. But that's after the lions almost ate them up.
Nice. Also in 2 Kings 17.
Same chapter. Yeah. No, I mean, it's an interesting aside about they moved to a different place and they didn't know how to worship and they complained. I mean, Mele, you moved us from our place, but what's this with the beasts?
The lions. Nice.
You didn't tell us anything about beasts.
So
He moved us into a rough. He moved us into a rough neighborhood.
Yeah, and then they start worshipping the Yud He Vav He plus their own gods.
all right, so
You can never be too careful.
exactly. Well, it's like hedging your bet.
Yeah.
There's that great character in the Mummy movies who has like religious symbols for all the different religions as he's hanging out with the Christians, as he's hanging out with the Muslims, as he's hanging out in the pharaonic tombs, right? And he pulls out his worry beads and he's like deciding which amulet is the right one to show at the time. But
we've got it in our own book too. I mean, nobody reads those chapters or those.
what's funny, because I have the reference, but from later in the chapter,
Yeah.
I clearly just read from the footnote and didn't start from before. So, reader question. What do you take of these people? They're speaking Hebrew. Language is going to be important. We're going to switch languages soon. They're at least being quoted in Hebrew. I'm not going to tell you what I think, but having just read it, notice that person's being quiet, so on tape we won't know who it is. So how do we take their approach to Zerubbabel and Yeshua?
To them, it's the most natural thing to be part of it. Hey, this is what we've been doing all the time. So all the more so when you come back and you want to build a temple, of course it's part of who we are and what we wanted to be part of.
Yeah.
And wasn't it worshiping God very geographic oriented at the time? If you were in this space and this is the God they worship,
For many people.
you're hooked into that.
Good. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Certainly back in the First Kingdom times, it seems like all you had to do was, if you immigrated to an area, just
Adopt the local.
start obeying the law and worshiping the local God.
But notice this isn't exactly the same, right? Because what happened the last time a group of Jews, right? It won't just be anachronistic. A group of Jews showed up in Israel. What was the reception by those who were already there?
I don't know what the reception was, but the Jews were
So,
supposed to annihilate
One,
them.
the Jews came sword in hand,
Yeah.
correct?
Exactly.
And what was the problem that generation or the next generation, the generation of the judges faced? Was it that those people kept wanting to come to our temple and to worship our God?
The opposite.
No, it's that the people, the Jews, again, anachronistically,
The Israel.
we wanted to go to their sites and worship their sites, which clearly was taboo. Right?
And also
But here
it was much more enticing and interesting.
Well, it wasn't
Lots that you could
G-rated.
see and all kinds of rituals. that
So
were
I don't
much
want to
more
extol
fun.
the virtues of ancient Canaanite religion.
Yeah.
That's not what I do for a living. But notice how different this is. As much as it feels like the same in terms of the God of the place and so forth, that God lost a war 2 generations before, and that site doesn't seem to be an active worship site. And these people don't come and say, look, why are you wasting your time for that defunct God who got, who lost his title, a couple of generations back, is not that important anymore. Come to us. We have so much fun. And some of it even looks like you because, we married your cousins. And so, we do matzah at Passover and so forth, but we do it in the name of Baal. But it's like the same thing anyway. I mean, look at the stuff that still happened. But it's not what they do. They come, and I will say with seeming sincerity, they say, can we come to your temple? Not just come, can we donate to your building fund? No, we don't want you here.
But
You have funny names.
the English, distinguishes this group by calling them adversaries. Is that
Correct. The Hebrew too.
So
Correct.
the narrator doesn't really see this as something that's just
Correct.
benign and these guys want
Correct.
to come in.
The narrator is very
donate.
editorializing.
Correct.
And let's remember the word sarei reminds us of
Egypt.
Of Egypt.
And Sarah is a second wife. Sarah is always, of course, Pnina v'Chana Sarata.
Oh, there you go.
The second wife. So there is an acknowledgement of a relationship because
Nice.
Tzarei Yehuda Binyamin, they are somehow related, they're somehow connected, but they are the tsarim, the adversaries. And the constraints of being together but still not liking each other very much.
Nice.
To me, it didn't bring Egypt so much as Metzarim and so on, but the tzara is the expression in Hebrew for a second wife. So you have to share something. It's something that is imposed upon you.
The ancient image of stepson, stepchild, second wife.
Well, biblically they had second wives.
Yeah.
So, but the expression is tzara, which is
Nice.
so the Tzarei Yehuda Binyamin gives us the same idea that they are related or they are connected.
In the text,
But they
but
didn't
in a
choose to
problematic
be that
relationship,
way.
right?
Yeah.
And the text introduces them that way. But I just find, again, that people would come and you can attribute to them false motives or being deceptive. Excuse me, if you want to. But they come and they say, look, we want to support you. Let us help you. We'll even worship your God with you. Isn't that lovely? I used to have Mormon neighbors. They came to Shabbos with us. You think, a nice thing.
Yeah.
But it's not going to go well.
Except the fact that they forgot that Judaism, even then, is very exclusionary. It's not inclusive at all. They don't mind being inclusive, but
they're not going to be well received.
On the wrong door.
Yeah, Bill?
Which is one of
I
these.
think I disagree with you because it was exclusionary to other gods. it was exclusionary to other religious...
Well, no, here it's going to be exclusionary to other people.
I know, but what I'm saying is that's a change. Because if you had gone back to before the conquest, as near as my readings have always indicated that when the stranger comes in, if he starts adopting your ways, he's an Israelite. It
depends on, if we're going to talk biblically, I would say it depends on where we open our Bibles. Right? Because, where non-Jews show up and so forth, they get treated in very different ways. Okay, what's neat about this is a group in a group. It's not an example of an individual who might be a stranger, who might be a second wife, maybe even an Egyptian second wife. That's like, the second wife of second wives. So that this is an interaction between us and them, but they seem to be very supportive and friendly and not enticing us to their place, which is I think that this is a different image of an other or a group of other than we see in other places. It's still not going to go well because it just never goes well. Harvey, you want to read it? Verse 3?
Yes. Okay. But Zerubbabel, along with Yeshua and the rest of the family heads of Israel, said to them, "It is not for you together with us to build a temple for our God. Rather, we by ourselves will build it for Hashem, God of Israel, as King Cyrus, king of Persia, has commanded us."
Good.
Then people of the land...
Let's hold on a second. Let's just spend a minute there, and then I don't mind if you keep reading. But so they're rebuffed, right? And the language is clear, right? It's like the old Lone Ranger joke. Who's we, Kimosabi? Right? What do you mean, Kimosabi? Right? It's like, no. God didn't say for you and me to do it. God just said for me to do it. It's not for us. It's for me. Now, what's really neat, and it depends on at what level one wants to do it. When they come, they call God Elohim, right? Your God. And in the rebuff to them, God is given his southern name. Yeah. Right? Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh.
Yeah.
So no, don't be confused. Now maybe don't be confused. This isn't what you've been doing at Shechem and Shiloh with your wife who is a descendant of my cousin or whatever. No. This is the real stuff. This is Southern religion. This is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Right? This is the house not of God, isn't that nice? But the God of the house of Hashem, for lack of a better term. So he's called Elohei Yisrael. So we get Adonai Elohei Yisrael, which is really interesting, and I think is begging to be interpreted, but isn't as clear to interpret for me as to what it could mean. It could be that's goes so far as to renounce the cultic sites of the God of Israel, that is Shechem and Shiloh and so forth, and we would say Dan, and it may be it's a big day in Catholic history today, so it may be a statement about Catholic Israel, right? The real people Israel, that we. Not only are we following the Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, but the God of Israel is our God. Don't tell me anything about what you do in those other cultic sites. So the language is neat.
I think that's good. That's very good, the God of Israel, the way it's brought out. I would like to note that they cite, though, Cyrus for the authority, the secular authority, to impress the other people. We've got this secular backing.
Outstanding.
For our position. And it may also be like, look, we don't want to exclude you, but Cyrus has commanded us to do this. I mean, that could be part of it too. I'm not sure exactly.
Well, the first point definitely, right? That we're here on the authority of the king.
Yeah.
We're not some rabble that's just wandered about, or we're not here as rebels. Mm-hmm. Cyrus not gave us permission, right? Tzivanu. He said, "Thou shalt do it," right? He mitzvahed us. Yeah. So that's on the level of the authority that we're laying claim to. That's pretty good.
Go on.
Yeah, please.
Then people of the land weaken the hands of the people. I'm reading from Stone, by the way. Then people of the land weakened the hands of the people of Judah and frightened them from building.
Good.
I
So,
don't know what that means, weaken the hands and so on.
This one version says undermine the resolve of the people of Judah.
Okay,
so
that's
why,
more-
and it links it to fear. So why? What were they afraid of?
That
Who?
they would
I think it
they would
means...
interfere in some way or other.
All right, hang on, hold the thought for 1 second to answer the who. I think the reading of the text is that
The locals.
the locals frightened and somehow weakened the returnees.
Yeah.
Returnees.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but why? Why were they made afraid?
Well, they got exiled one time. They know what it's like
Good.
to be rebuffed, and perhaps,
Little gun shy.
well, they came back to do a thing, and they've already met a problem.
Right.
Nobody likes to be rejected, and if those locals are rejected from participating, they'll stand around and either make fun of them or try to do whatever they could to, I don't know, ridicule them, make whatever, tell them, even if they didn't do anything physical, they made them feel so uncomfortable because nobody likes the idea of, hey, I was here before, now you won't let me play? I'm going to disrupt your play.
Correct. And we don't have the details yet as to what those details are.
But they were already in that state of mind because the year before they were in such a hurry to get the sacrifices on the way, for fear of the people around.
Yeah, it did have that fear
They
comment to
mentioned-
it.
So they kind of like had a mindset.
Correct. So,
And that gives us an idea that the Judeans anticipated problems before they even happened. So no matter what those locals would do, and whichever way they behave, it would be interpreted as negative.
has something to be afraid. And remember, the first verb here is that they did something bad, whatever the merapim is, but that they somehow weakened something them. So they did do something.
You could have just stood around in mass.
Correct.
You know, I mean, depending, we don't know numbers here, right? We don't know numbers here, but, you know,
Well, but we can assume,
the locals may outnumber the returnees.
I think we can assume that at this point that the locals outnumber the
So
returnees.
Just by force of numbers, it's a
Nice.
little intimidating to say, you know, go away, and that they're basically, right, we said go away, the returnees said go away, and they just stand there. That could be intimidating.
Exactly, in and of itself.
What it says in the old JPS one is, it says, and they harried them while they were building.
Okay.
They heard
Harried, bothered, pestered, molested.
Okay. So I'm imagining.
It's a great expression in Hebrew. Mevahalim otam. They were making them kind of woo,
Confused, flustered.
flustered or fearful.
And harrying someone.
Yes,
and
yes.
mocking someone.
I'm imagining this
Well, but do they do
standing
harried?
around.
I'm sorry. Do they do harried for the first verb or the second verb? Read the
Well,
whole
first
verse.
They say, then the people of the land were weak. Then the people of the land weakened the hands of the people.
Okay,
of
so it
Judah
does the
and
weaken.
harried them while they were
Right.
building.
So it does it for mivahalim. Sorry, Jane.
That's okay. I was just imagining, and totally irreverently here, that they're what's happening is they're all standing around going, "Can you believe these people? What have they ever built? They've been in exile. What do they know about building? What do they know about this land? They don't know that this was a sand pit, and now they're trying to build on top of it."
And they're doing it all wrong. You know the way people stand around a construction
It
site.
doesn't take much. I mean, these people really didn't build anything until
Right,
now.
that's what I'm saying.
So,
There's a lot of whistling and hooting going on.
What's interesting is, so the current JPS says, right, undermine the resolve and made them afraid to build. They bribed ministers in order
So
to.
we haven't read that verse yet, but yes.
But the old one says after harried, and before they get to, it says, and they hired counselors against them.
yeah, that's the next verse.
Right.
That's
As
what
Which
we-
apparently
As
means
opposed
they
to
didn't have
bribe.
their EIR, their environmental impact.
Right.
The
So
lawsuit
we'll get there in a
city.
second. The I guess the last thing I want to say before we read that verse, it'll be Lois in a sec, is think about narratives whether they're historical narratives or even fictional narratives, of settlers, right? Of those who are coming to a new land. So sometimes we tell the story about how the Indians embraced them with open arms and invited them to Thanksgiving, or planted corn with them, or whatever, right? But more often than not, the literary motif is somebody comes in and the natives, the indigenous, the aborigines, whoever that they aren't friendly and happy about seeing them. And what I find remarkable about the text is it starts kind of happy. They come and they say, "Oh, let us help you because we'll pray to your God. That's kind of fun, a little different. Get on board with it." But then once it doesn't go so well, then it looks like every other, white man, red man kind of narrative. Did you want to say that?
Well, I was just going to say, that's because history's always written by the winners. I'm not sure
Correct.
we're the winners here, but
We will be.
anyway. We might be the exception of the people who wrote the history.
No,
at least our
but
part
we will
of the
be.
history.
And this is in the end a winner's tale. That is, we tell the story of our coming back and successfully rebuilding.
And we're still reading it.
And we're still reading it, so that's like the longer term success.
Right.
Yeah. William?
I do want to point out that if you look at it from Cyrus's point of view, I don't think that they're doing, that Nehemiah or Ezra, whoever is in charge here, is doing quite what he had in mind. Because his idea was apparently to release all the captives of Babylon, go to your various home countries, and of course only the Jews still bothered to maintain an identity. Go and settle, and you will be my edge of the empire out there. And I suspect that he thought they were going to go and settle in and find all their cousins and create a
One big happy family.
One big happy family again. We're back in business. We've got a good king over us, and we're all happy. And instead, it's like, oh no, we're back. You guys. Get out of here.
Good. And what we have is we actually have, interestingly enough, and this leads up to the Romans, who will offer, a fourth and a different one, but we won't be there in this book. We now have a series of 3 different general foreign policy outlooks. Right? Everybody's making a big deal. It's a big day in Rome, but it's a big week for John Kerry also in American diplomacy, and we'll see where the new Secretary of State is going to lead us. We go from the Assyrians, from Ashurbanipal and Sargon II, who beat you fair and square in war, whatever that means, and then they take the men away. They bring in men from all sorts of different places, not just Assyrian men, but they scramble up the populations. And when everybody becomes, part of the same mutt, that mongrel we call Assyria, and you have no more local identity and local loyalty because everybody is mixed, is hybridized. Okay, from there to the Babylonians. Babylonians conquer. What do? They take the nobility, and they say, you don't want to cause trouble in Judah because your kings and your priests, or your kings, princes, and priests, they're all here. Yeah. So pay us tax and sit quietly, and we'll let them be okay. We don't need to abuse them. They're not in prison or anything. But that's how we will control you as a foreign occupier. Now we come to Koresh, to the Persians, and he has a different one. He says, look, and that's why it's interesting to me, and I think the understanding of why the permission is given. It's neat that the descendant of David that Zerubbabel goes back with them, but Koresh's permission isn't God, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Hashem told me for you to go back and set up kingship. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh told me to let you go back and build him a house and worship him nicely, right? That'll be my bone to appease you as your new ruler, because he didn't make it a free place, right? And you'll pay me tax, but I will help you to do, a different kind of kingdom.
And right. He didn't even think about telling them and play nice with the locals.
Correct, because I agree with Bill in the sense, you're taking people, from Des Moines and putting them back in Des Moines. Of course, they're going to get along with the people who are still in Des Moines. So that's the context for what's here. But I think we really do have 3 different visions of empire building and foreign policy in a world of empire building. And so in this next part, what we're going to read now isn't what Koresh had in mind, or Cyrus had in mind, when he told them to go do it, because it doesn't look, thank goodness we're in a room with Jews, because it just begs anti-Semitic jokes. And when we can do it together, we can chuckle about them. But what was he thinking? What did he think? What doesn't he know these people? What did he think would happen? Come on.
Yeah.
Go home. All right, so Lois, verse 5.
They bribed ministers in order to thwart their plans all the years of King Cyrus of Persia and until the reign of King Darius of Persia.
Read one more verse.
And in the reign of Ahasuerus, at the start of his reign, they drew up an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah.
Good.
Oh, now it starts.
Now we're taking it to court.
So they first do something like being a burr under the saddle, or they try to get in the way. They bribe ministers, right? They hire people to thwart it. But then finally, clearly they want to really make sure that it doesn't happen, and so they send a nasty letter back to the king of Persia. And what is the noun of the thing that they write?
Sitna. Hate.
No, not sin'ah.
Katu sitna.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sitna.
lehastin, hasatan.
Satan.
Right.
Where's
This is now
that?
adversary.
Where is that?
It's the middle of verse 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The sixth word of 6. Ooh, it's almost 666. Of course it's sitna. If only we were in chapter 6, I could really make the point. Right? So it's really fun in terms of, you can do all sorts of playful things. It's a good verb for it. It's the verb to be opposed to be against.
The New JPS is accusation. What's the stone translation?
Calumny.
What?
Calumny.
Calumny. Calumny.
Okay.
Nice. So it's just a great word for it, for whatever it's worth. And it's a neat word to look at. Here's a relatively, depending on what you compare it to, it's an earlier or late usage. But kind of fun. All right, so now they're really trying to thwart the building project.
That's a long time. How much time went from Cyrus to Darius?
The dating of all of this in Ezra is really befuddled. Okay, so I don't have the table of kings of Persia in front of me. That's a question that we could do the dating to. But as it relates, when we go to Haggai, the building starts in the time of Darius. So what we have is like a false start that then gets paused for a period of time, and it will be restarted. It's not restarted yet. We'll probably have to wait a week, maybe 2 weeks before it will be restarted. And there are a lot of different attempts to try and figure out the dating of the initial wave of the return. We're going to see who comes back with them after they get permission and what the difference is, as opposed to the Edict of Cyrus, which let them go back in the first place, to what's going to happen in response to this letter.
But is it reasonable to assume that we haven't changed generations or anything? That it's just all these same people? Or
Good. So when we get to more names, and we actually have a bunch of names if you go back to the list of the initial returnees, but we'll see who's leading the community, right? Because we were given the name of the priest and we're given the name of the descendant of David, Yeshua and Zerubbabel, as the leaders. Let's do one more verse. Let's do one more verse and one more word, and then I think we'll call it a day.
you want me to finish that?
Either way.
And in the time of Artaxerxes, Bishlam, Mithridates, Tabeel, and the rest of their colleagues wrote to King Artaxerxes of Persia a letter written in Aramaic and translated.
Okay. So, we just to point it out, verse 6 says a letter. Verse 7 says a letter. There's a lot of parallel from 6 to 7. We're talking about the same letter, except one is Malchut Achashverosh and one is Malchut Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes. In case Artaxerxes wasn't hard enough to say in English. Artaxerxes. So notice the parallels between the two pieces. Notice the second one is already very aware of languages, that the language that they have been speaking at this point is Hebrew, but the letter can't be sent in Hebrew, right? Because whether we're talking about Achashverosh or Artaxerxes aren't Hebraicist, as they will say. One more thing, for a non-JPS translation, does anybody have something different for in the time of Artaxerxes, Bishlam? Does somebody have something else in their verse besides Bishlam?
Tabil.
Tabil comes after it, after Mithridath.
Tabil.
So everybody has Bishlam. That's really interesting because there are translations that see Bishlam as not being somebody's name, but as being a comment from up above. Up above it says, Al Yoshvei Yehuda V'Yerushalayim. And here, there are translations that
means what?
that about those who were dwelling in Judah, and Jerusalem, and here that in the days of Artaxerxes that they wrote a letter, B'Yerushalayim.
Bishlam.
B'Yerushalayim. That it's either an abbreviated term. There are others who want to make it B'Shem Yerushalayim, that they wrote it kind of in the name of Jerusalem. And the interesting text, and I'll tell you why I think it's interesting. The Septuagint reads it, and I can't translate it, I can't quote the Septuagint, but reads it Bishalom. They wrote it like you would write a letter, sincerely yours or whatever. People still send letters in Hebrew, Bishalom. It's at peace sounds wrong. That's like the last letter you write.
Stone skips it.
It doesn't say Bishlam?
Well, not in English.
It doesn't have the word Bishlam at all?
How does it translate in the beginning of 7?
We read
In
7.
the days of Artaxerxes, with an asterisk, okay, Mithridath, Tabil, and the rest of his, and that's Mithridath, hyphen Tabil, small t.
One person,
Yeah, and the rest of his cohorts wrote a greeting.
A greeting. This is the Bishlam.
That's Bishlam.
Yeah.
To Artaxerxes.
Shalom, my king!
Yeah.
King of Persia.
Yeah.
Okay, but it says that Artaxerxes was Cyrus.
Yeah, so that's part of the problem of...
Generic term for king in Persian, like Pharaoh and Necho.
Right, and we actually know on the one, Stone's wrong there, but two, that we know on the list, because we have the list of kings of Persia, that there's an Artaxerxes the first and an Artaxerxes the second. It's like we have that problem with Ramses. When people start quoting or talking about the Pharaoh Ramses, that we have more than one Ramses. You have
one Bush.
You got a bunch of Henrys.
Yeah.
You think Bush is a problem. Henry was really a problem in England. But already in the days of the Septuagint, which isn't all that long after this was written, a couple centuries after the text, it clearly doesn't say B'Yerushalayim, and either, I guess you could argue, following Stone, you could argue that the Septuagint got it correct, or I would say more likely it already is a difficult text in the times of the Septuagint, that it's not clear what to make of it. Because that's not an expression, I think, that we would have anywhere else biblically. That is, that somebody writes a letter, Bishalom, saying hi or greetings or wishing somebody in that way.
Yeah, but this whole thing now shifts gear into the Aramaic text.
Good, and then I'm going to do one more word, and then we're going to stop for today. And it's neat that the versing of it, and even the way the scroll is written, that is, there's a gap after the next word before the beginning of verse 8. If you're in the JPS, I don't know if Stone gives you the good, that's the JPS. I don't know if Stone gives you the pei and the samech in the middle of the text where there's a break or a pause, or just writes the Hebrew that way. But before that break, before verse 8, is the word Aramit. So it tells you, in case you missed it, in case you wouldn't notice when you start reading things like Malka, Kanema, Edayin, Rechum, Be'el Ta'im, Ushim Shai, Safra, right? The language switches.
Yes.
It's all Aramaic.
And so this is now, and it's not even just the letter yet. We have a little bit of stage direction or narrative before we'll quote from the letter. That'll be next week. But we total shift the language. And it's not like in Daniel, where Daniel's written in Hebrew, except it's got a lot of Aramaications and borrowed words and other things. It's like, Spanglish or whatnot. Here is a full shift in language. And we get a little, almost like a parenthetical note, except there aren't parentheses, that says, okay, Aramit. Now we're going to speak Aramaic, and I'll tell you what's happening. Harvey?
Just the Stone edition again. It says, the text of the letter was written in Aramaic script and in the Aramaic language.
Nice.
Why is it two?
Good. So one of the things that has now changed in the world, or in the world, it's all about us, in our world, is in the old days, we used to use the Hebrew typeface to write Hebrew. And I assume that back then, if you went to visit Aram or Aram Tzora, that they would have used the Aramaic typeface, or whatever its early form was, to do Aramaic. But now, and now means from the time we have the written Torah forward, the typeface that's used for Aramaic is Aramaic, big deal. But the typeface for the stuff before, the way you and I learned to write an Aleph and a Bet and a Gimel and a Dalet, is not ancient Hebrew. It's the ancient Aramaic typeface.
So it's like transliteration.
But it's the same letters.
Same font.
It's the same different font. It's like it's the closer parallel, and I can show you in a book, would be what we think of as Hebrew in Rashi script. It's the same letters, one-to-one correspondence altogether, or even from block letters to cursive, you could argue. Right? It's just a different form of writing the letters, and each letter is a cognate, is a parallel to another letter. But it looks different, And this is we for the last 25 centuries use the Aramaic font for the Hebrew language. So that's the stone comment there. And it's really fun because the Midrash plays with it. There's somewhere in the middle of the Ten Commandments, I forget the word, there is the Hebrew letter ayin in one of the words, which the way we learn to write Hebrew, it's not a problem. It looks something like this. Is it like that for you? Whatever it is, but it's, and it's got a little tail on the end, it's not a problem. But there's a Midrash that says that one of the cool things about the Ten Commandments is it's cut all the way through. So if you looked at the back of the Ten Commandments, you could, and if you knew how to read, left to right in Hebrew, or had a mirror, you could read it with pierced all the way through. And so somebody asked the question, what about, and whatever the word is, I don't know what the word is, but it has the letter ayin in it, which in the Aramaic script looks like this, but in the ancient Hebrew script actually looks like an ayin.
Mm-hmm.
It's, it's what's that, an oval, or something like an oval with a dot in the middle, like an ayin, an eye, just one of them. So the question is, if this is carved all the way through, how can you make that letter carved all the way through? And the Midrash answers and says that that's what it was, that there was a floating piece of rock in the middle there, that again, it's God's book,
You can do whatever you want.
It's not exactly. In the scope of stuff, it's not all that impressive. But what I love about the Midrash is the Midrash knows, and there are other passages in the Talmud. David Weiss-Olivny has this great book that points to it, where they know that the original Torah looked different than the Torah that we have because it was written in cursive and ours is in block letters, right? Because it was written in Hebrew letters and ours is written in Aramaic letters. And that's a remarkable thing for them to be aware of and to not have a major problem with. I mean, that Midrash is playing with it, but the David Weiss-Olivny texts from the Talmud that he brings are very aware of the changes. Bill?
Just wanted to mention that in several of the Isaiah scrolls from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the holy name is written in Hebrew,
correct,
not in Aramaic.
Yeah. Easy to find those pictures online, and in fact, all the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the collection from Jerusalem are now visible online. It's a great website if you haven't played with it.
And whenever God is written, it's written in the ancient Hebrew script.
All right.